Welcome back. In this video we're going to talk about constraints. Constraints are objects that we can use with dynamic simulations that allow us to constrain rigid bodies and pin them down and have them behave in different ways. Instead of explaining it to you, I'll just show it to you and then it'll make a lot more sense what constraints are. So let's hit F12 to maximize this camera viewport here. And we're going to need some kind of test dummies, some kind of objects that we can use to play around with. So I'll go to the Get menu, go to Primitive, go to Polygon Mesh, and I'll create a cube. Close the PPG, scale it down a little bit, it's a little bit big. Move it up here. Okay, that's good. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and turn that into a rigid body. So we'll go over here to the Create menu and go to Rigid Body, and we'll go to Passive Rigid Body because we don't want that object to be affected by things like gravity and so forth. Close the PPG. Okay, now I'm going to take this same cube here and I'm going to duplicate it by hitting Control, Alt, and D on the keyboard. And I'll move the duplicate down like so. So the duplicate's right underneath this one up here. Now I'll create a force of gravity, so I'll go up to the Force menu and select Gravity. There's my gravity, and I'll just move it up and out of the way. Remember that moving the gravity icon doesn't affect the gravity at all. It's just changing its orientation, the way that it's aiming, that'll change that. Okay, so now that I have that, you'll notice that when I hit play to start the simulation, nothing happens. This is because the bottom cube here is still a passive rigid body, so I want to change it to an active rigid body. So I'll select it, I'll go to the Modify menu and go to Rigid Body and select Edit Rigid Body. Now I can go ahead and change this. So I'll scroll down to the rigid body properties parameter set down here, and you'll see the passive parameter here is checked on. Let's uncheck it, and that automatically turns it into an active rigid body. So now when I hit play, it falls down. Now 100 frames is a very small number, so I'm going to need more frames. So I'll increase this to say 500, and I'll also turn on looping mode here for the animation. And you should see these white tick marks at the end of the timeline and at the beginning. And if I hit play, you'll see that the cube there falls down. Okay, so let's say we want to hook up this bottom cube to the top cube, almost like an anchor, so that the top cube holds on to the bottom cube here. And even though the bottom cube will be affected by gravity, it won't fall down. It'll just kind of dangle and hang about there because of the top cube here is passive and it's anchored down. So how can we do that in exercise to stop this from happening and having the cube just fall for eternity? Well, we can use constraints for that. So what we'll do is we'll go over here to the Create menu, go to Rigid Body, and you'll see down here we have two options. One is Rigid Constraint, the other is the MultiConstraint Tool. For now we'll use the Rigid Constraint Tool, and later we'll move on to the MultiConstraint Tool and see how you can do some neat and awesome things with that. So we'll click on Rigid Constraint here, and you'll see that we have a sub-menu. We can choose up to 5 different types of constraints available to us in XSI for our dynamic simulation. So we have a hinge constraint, ball and socket, and so on and so forth. Let's select the ball and socket. We'll come back to the different constraints later. Once I do that, you notice my mouse cursor changes, and now I go into a sort of PIC session here. Okay, and you also notice this green object appeared here at the origin of the scene. That's actually normal behavior. What that green object is, it represents the actual ball and socket constraint that we created. What we have to do now is we have to tell XSI where we want to place the constraint. So wherever we left mouse button click anywhere in our viewport, XSI will place the constraint. So let's say I want to place the constraint in between these two cubes. So I'll left click there, and now you see the constraint object moved from the scene origin to the point where I left clicked. And now XSI wants me to go ahead and choose the rigid bodies that I want to be constrained with this ball and socket constraint. So what I'll do is I'll select the first one, the top one up here. Now XSI wants me to select the last one, which is the second one. So I'll select this one down here. One important thing to note is that this rigid constraint tool only allows you to constrain 2 objects, so you can't constrain more than 2 objects. So later we'll talk about the multi-constraint tool that allows us to connect lots more objects together. Okay, so once we created that constraint and finished the PIC session, you notice that the constraint property page opened up here for us automatically, and we can see the name here, ball and socket. We can rename it to whatever we want. Okay, and down here we have 2 tabs for these different constraint properties. But let's close the PPG now just to focus on the constraint here. I'm going to switch to shading mode, and I'm also going to turn on wireframe unshaded, which makes it a little bit easier to see what's going on. There's our constraint. You can select the constraint and you can actually move it around. So I can move it out here, I can move it out here, wherever I really want to move it to, I can move it. So I'll place it here so it's somewhere about in the middle. Okay. So there's our constraint. Now if I hit play, you'll notice that the cube here on the bottom doesn't fall down. It is being affected by gravity. However, it's hooked up with that constraint there, so it's not going to be going anywhere. This allows you to create all kinds of different types of simulations, such as chains, or maybe something just hooked up to something else, maybe a hinge on a door. All kinds of different things can be created with these constraints. Really, you're only constrained by your own imagination here. No pun intended. Okay, maybe a little bit. But you can see how this constraint is doing an excellent job just holding onto that cube and just working the way it's supposed to. Okay, so let me hit home here on the keyboard to go back to the first frame and select the bottom cube, and I'm just going to move it like so, and then I'll hit play. And you'll notice that the cube falls and reacts the way that it probably would in real life if it was hooked up like this from a cable or a swing or something like that. So you can see how this could come in really useful, and you can see there's so many possibilities that you can use with dynamics and constraints in XSI. Okay, so let me just move this cube back over here. So that's how you can constrain very quickly and easily two objects in XSI. However, this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to constraints. There's a lot more things that we can do with constraints. So let's look at the MultiConstraint Tool and see how we can create a more interesting simulation here. If you want to get rid of the constraint, you can simply select it and hit delete on the keyboard. And that'll get rid of it for you. So now I'm back to square one, where if I hit play for the simulation, the cube will just fall into infinity. So what I'm going to do this time, I'm going to select this cube, I'm going to move it over like so, then I'm going to duplicate it. So I want to create a couple of copies of this cube, so I'll hit Control, Alt, and D on the keyboard to make a copy, and I'll move it up, and I'll hit Control, Alt, and D again, and move another duplicate up like so. So I have these three objects, and if I hit play, all three of them fall with gravity, which is perfect. That's exactly what I want. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to constrain all of these objects to this one anchor object over here, to this cube over here. So it's pretty simple to do this. Simply go to the Create menu, go to Rigid Body, and instead of using the Rigid Constraint Tool, we'll use the MultiConstraint Tool. And you can see it has the same exact constraints from the Rigid Constraint Tool. The only difference is now we can apply these constraints to multiple objects. So we'll select the ball and socket constraint again, because it works just fine for this. And now we go into a PIC session. What we have to do is select all the objects in XSI that we want to constrain to some kind of an anchor object or a master object. So to do that easily, we'll hold down Shift and left click on each object that we want to constrain. So we want to constrain these three objects. Now, what do we want to constrain them to? We want to constrain them to this anchor object over here, this passive rigid body that's not going to move. So we'll middle mouse button click on that object, and that goes ahead and connects all the cubes there. So you can see we have these green dotted lines, and there's one green dotted line going from each one of these active cubes to this passive cube over here. So since we're done with the PIC session, we'll hit the right mouse button to go ahead and end that PIC session. The PPG opens up for that constraint. We'll close that, however. Okay, so now if I hit play, watch what happens. All of the objects are now hooked up to that one object, and they can all hit each other, they can all make contact with each other, and they react pretty realistically, as you can see. So you can make a pendulum, you can make maybe a grandfather clock, and really, if you were making a cartoon, you can maybe make one of those demolition balls that knocks the buildings over, and maybe you can make a cartoon about some character getting hit by one of those or something like that. Really, the possibilities are pretty much endless. You can model, say, a car and make an animation of the car going through a brick wall, and all the bricks can just break apart and just fall down with gravity and so on and so forth. So the possibilities with these constraints and with dynamics and XSI are pretty much unlimited. They're only limited by your own imagination, so I encourage you to be creative with it and just come up with some interesting simulations. Okay, So that's how you can constrain multiple objects to one. Now let's have a look at how to constrain objects, multiple objects, in a chain-like fashion. And this is going to be very interesting. So I'll go ahead and I'll select all of these green dotted lines, and you can just do that by simply selecting them all, holding down shift while you do that, or just select them all at one time. And just hit delete on the keyboard and it'll get rid of them. And if I hit play, I'm back to square one. The cubes just fall down. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take all the cubes and I'm just going to go ahead and move them underneath the anchor cube up here, the cube that's not going to move, and I'm going to make a chain out of these, almost like a rope. And it's going to be very easy to do. If I come over here to the create menu, I can go back to rigid body and go back to the MultiConstraint Tool, and I'll use the ball and socket constraint again. Now, to go ahead and create a chain out of these objects, I can't use the shift select method, because that method's not going to take the priority, the order of the priority, or the ordering priority into account. So to tell XSI which order that I want these objects to be constrained in, what I'll do is I'll left click this bottom cube here, since it's the last one in my chain. Then what I'll do is I'll middle mouse button click this top one, and that'll connect the first one I selected to the top one. Now I can use the middle mouse button again to middle mouse button click on this top one, and now you'll see that there's a connection between those two. So now the bottom one's connected to this middle one's connected to this top one, and now this top one I can connect to the anchor up here simply by using the middle mouse button again, and there we go. Now I just hit the right mouse button to end the session. Let's close that PPG. Now if I hit play, you'll notice that all of the cubes are attached to each other one after the other in the order that I chose. So what does that mean? That means I can have some fun with this. What I'm going to do is hit 8 on the keyboard to open up the Explorer, and I'm in my environment scope. So if you click up here, click on environments, you should see the environments pop up right here. You'll also notice that under the constraints grouping here, we now have all of our constraints there. So the first, the second, and third ball socket constraints that we created, because we did create 3 constraints here in our scene, are all automatically placed in the current environment's constraints grouping over here. So this group is going to contain all the constraints that belong to this current environment. Okay? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and open up the simulation time control properties. So I can select simulation time control and hit enter on the keyboard to do that. And once I do that, let me go ahead and close this Explorer window. Here's my time control, my simulation time control properties. Okay? Right now we're in the default live play mode. Let's switch to interactive mode to make things more interesting. I'll close that PPG. Now with the interactive mode turned on, I can do something different. Let's hit play and watch this simulate. And it is simulating right now. There is some slight little bit of bending or movement there by these cubes. Okay, now that we're in interactive mode, we can actually grab these cubes and interact with them in real time. So I'll select the bottom cube and I'll just slightly move it like so, and then let it go. And you can see the gravitational effect and the dynamics effect working in real time in my viewport. Almost like a real-time video game. So it's actually pretty neat, and you can test out different types of simulations using this method, combining the interactive mode with these different types of constraints. So I can just grab this bottom cube and just interactively move them and drop them. Almost like grabbing it with my own hand and just pulling it up and dropping it in real life as if it was attached to a rope. So you can start to move this all around and kind of just grab it and let it go quickly with your mouse movements. It's almost like you're grabbing it in real life and just throwing it around and flicking it and just slapping it around and seeing what you can come up with. And it's actually very neat how this works in real time, and it's so fast. Look at that. That's pretty awesome. So now this thing's just going to keep on moving or whatnot until it stops, and it'll stop based on its parameters. And we'll check those parameters in the next video. Okay, so that's pretty neat. That's pretty fun, isn't it? Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to end this video here. Now you saw how to constrain objects. In the next video, we'll talk about more details about constraining objects. We'll talk about the parameters and the property pages and how to go ahead and change the behavior and the characteristics of these different constraints. So we'll do that in the next video. I'll see you then.